You knew I was going to do that.
Yeah, I always knew. Alright, I've got Uber Archangel here, and he's a bit of an overclocker. So we're going to get into overclocking today. Now, explain overclocking.
Overclocking is essentially where you run your parts faster than they were manufacturally made to run. It's just like taking an engine and putting a blower on it to increase the speed on your engine for your car. Same idea, a little bit different for electronics, but same idea.
Alright. Well, you know, there's also underclocking.
Yeah, underclocking is meant mainly for laptops. What it'll actually do is it'll increase your battery power, therefore you don't have to use your batteries often like you have.
That's one thing, especially Mustang has shown in previous segments, that you know the reason that computers are getting hotter, which is something we're going to have to cover with this, is cooling. What happens is we're getting parts so small that when you're putting electrons through it, it generates more heat. It's kind of like when you have a very small thin tube and you're putting way too much pressure through it, in this case electrons, it generates more heat. So the number one enemy to any computer is heat.
Yeah, there's multiple ways of cooling for overclocking. You can go anything from air to water to liquid nitrogen to dry ice. There's a plethora of ways to cool your computer. I prefer air cooling. When done right, you can get relatively close temperatures to water cooling without the cost.
Alright, well, what are generally, like, alright, you got a computer. You can go to like mom and pop computer shop, or you can go to your local electronic retailer and pick up a computer these days. Are those okay for overclocking, or is it something that you should just go... I mean, me personally, I don't do a lot of overclocking. I used to back in the day, maybe a couple of megahertz on the old Celerons and whatnot, but you wouldn't exactly go to Gateway or Dell or Toshiba or IBM to get your parts. You'd sit there, you'd go to a computer shop, you do all your research about the clock speed and the bus. Go into a little bit of that.
If you buy a Dell computer, Gateway computer, you might be able to marginally overclock it, and by that I mean maybe 200 megahertz top end if you're lucky with putting extra cooling and everything on top of it. If you buy the parts that are specifically made to run faster, you can normally overclock a lot higher. Like the computer I'm going to be showing in a later segment, I will probably be able to hit 4 to 4.2 gigahertz off of a 3.2 gigahertz base.
Now, would you go with Intel or AMD, or is it really just do your homework?
A lot of it's do your homework, and if you don't have a lot of money, AMD, you can normally get a black edition for a lot cheaper than you can get a Intel black edition. So what the black edition is, it's an unlock multiplier that allows you to increase the speed very easily.
Alright, multiplier. You know what, I'm just going to let you do this. Multiplier and clock bus, go into that, explain it a bit.
Everything starts out at 100 megahertz front side bus. Believe it or not, that's actually what everything is. What it'll have is you have double data rate, and then you have DDR2, and it ends up multiplying it up to where you get 800 and 1200 megahertz out of your RAM. The average computer, it just starts at 200 when you're looking in the BIOS, because it already takes into effect some of the multipliers from it. When you increase your front side bus, you're going to increase the speed of your RAM and your processor, and depending on whether you have AMD or Intel, it can actually increase the Northbridge communication speed. Now, there are dividers that will separate it up between Intel and AMD. Depending on what you have will depend on whether you actually have a way to separate those so that you'll be able to control the front side bus strictly for the processor and strictly for the RAM and strictly for the VGA. With the more modern motherboards, almost VGA is almost always able to be controlled independently of the rest, but in prior boards it was not.
Yeah. And as always, the faster that you're going to clock your CPU, your graphics, and your RAM, the more heat it's going to generate. And heat is a number one enemy of overclocking. Now, I did overclocking a very long time ago. You remember earlier we were talking about overclocking Macs. Now, back in the day, I think it was the Motorola 68K CPUs, which are also used in the Sega Genesis, which you can easily overclock. Now, you can even overclock an NES. Back in the old days, you just take out the frequency oscillator, which was the actual clock for the front side bus, but nowadays it's all software controlled under the BIOS. Now, the one bad thing about buying from an actual OEM provider, especially Dell, is all of the BIOS features are locked out. So certain motherboard manufacturers, this is where BIOS hacking comes in, and it also falls into some of the firmware hacks that we're probably going to be covering on the show, and some of those techniques as well. Is there like specific manufacturers that you as an overclocker would look for?
For motherboards, yes. For if you're looking for general brands, there's also preferences there. If I were to look for a computer that I want to be able to overclock right off the bat, I'm going to be looking at Voodoo. I'm going to be looking at Falcon Northwest. The reason why is they use off-stock parts. They also use parts that are meant to last a really long time, which is what you're looking for when you go to overclock. Because as you overclock, as Fox said, you will increase the heat. And as you increase heat, it's going to increase wear and tear on your parts. And as wear and tear increases, life of parts decreases. So if you buy good parts to begin with that are going to last you probably 2 years after the warranty runs out, so you're looking at 5 years, when you overclock it, you're going to knock it back to 3 years. But the thing is, it's going to pan out because by 3 years, you're probably going to need to buy new parts anyway.
Yeah, computers usually have an average lifespan these days between 1.5 and 3 years. So, I find a lot of computers in the garbage. Whether they're overclockable or not is completely moot. Now, why would you overclock? Now I know you do a lot of gaming. I'm the anti-gamer. I fucking hate gamers. I hate you. Alright, I hate you.
I know you do. I know you do.
Okay. Because you can't handle my kind of love. You can't. So, besides gaming, because gaming does require a lot of extra power and performance, what other reasons would you want?
Well, I get this question a whole lot, and the way I justify it is you buy the parts and you don't overclock in the beginning. And people look at me like I'm nuts. Well, why am I spending this extra money? You might spend an extra $50 getting the parts that you actually need to overclock over what you would normally be buying. That $50 will translate into normally 6 to 7 months that you'll be able to extend your hardware by overclocking it to match the needs of the software that's coming out. Therefore expanding the lifetime of your computer and saving more money to be able to buy your next computer.
You know, I actually do know quite a few people that will actually overclock multi-core CPU systems so they can compile code faster, because they do some pretty hardcore stuff. So it's not just for gaming. But with overclocking, you will shorten the overall life expectancy of your hardware. But then again, that's also for underclocking. I mean, back in the early days, we're talking 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, the Intel Celeron processor and the Pentium 2 processors, like Archangel said, that normally it starts out with a 100 megahertz front side bus, and it was the BIOS that determined the actual clock multiplier of the CPU frequency. So when you first turn the computer on and you go in, although you have a 450 megahertz CPU, it wants to run at 233 because it's at a default clock multiplier. If you actually take that, I actually have 450 megahertz CPUs that I have downclocked to about 300 megahertz that still work today, and they are at least 10 years old. I've actually got MMX CPUs still in use today, and you're probably saying, Fox, what the fuck am I going to do with a 150 megahertz CPU? You'd be surprised how useful something that low power could be used. As we've been trying to explain through BSOD, it's not how hard it doesn't matter how big your hardware is, it doesn't matter how fast it is, it doesn't matter how strong it is. The right tool for the right job. So let's go into some more of the other stuff. Like, what operating systems would you recommend overclocking for, or does it matter?
It does matter slightly, depending on which way you're going to overclock. If you are going to be able to get at the BIOS, so you actually built your computer so that you can get to the BIOS and be able to change the BIOS, it's not going to matter what platform you use at all in the slightest. One thing I do want to touch on before we get into OSs is warranties. When you overclock, 99% of the time you have voided your warranty. This is also why I said you overclock towards the end of the expected life of your parts to just get that extension of 6 or 7 months, because your warranty is already up.
You know, and I think we've showcased on previous episodes, warranties, accidental insurance, absolute must-have when you have that hacker mindset of, I'm going to take this apart, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm most likely going to break it, and I'm going to get my ass kicked if I out a couple of hundred, even if $1,000 on a piece of hardware because you didn't know what the hell you were doing.
Yeah, there's actually certain brands that will allow you to overclock. Like OCZ is set up for overclockers. They have an added voltage protection called EVP or EPV, and it'll give you an extension on the amount of voltage you can send to your RAM, allowing you to run your RAM at higher frequency. So depending on what the brand is, you can actually get warranties that will cover mild overclocking.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, they just started it about a year ago, that they have warranties now where you can actually overclock. Now, it depends on the brand. You got to read up on your warranties. But OCZ is one of them where it has a 2.1 volt normal extended voltage for certain RAMs. Not all RAMs are covered. Platinum Edition is normally covered completely for the...
Well, something I want to touch into. I'm an electronics guy. Everyone should know that by now. And everyone wonders why lower voltage is better. Most people say higher voltage is better, but let me put it to you like this. Back in the early days when RAM ran from 0 to 5 volts, meaning 0 is logic 0 and 5 volts is logic 1, the amount of time it takes to go from 0 to 5 volts is more if you had to go from 0 to 3 or 0 to 1.5. So the less voltage that you need, that spike and increase of voltage, is less time because, you know, it's distance. It's a physical distance. You have to get less distance. So there are actual mods, like especially back in the day, we actually had to do motherboard mods and change out capacitors and inductors and whatnot to actually shorten the actual response time. Also, power supplies are very important. You got to make sure you get a decent power supply, because if your power supply has a lot of noise and it's a shitty power supply, I know people that have spent over $3,000 on a really hardcore computer and $15 on a power supply.
Yeah. You got to, when you're buying a computer and you're building overclocking, you have to make sure your amperage is going to be able to handle what you're going to be overclocking.
You can never have too much. You can never have too much. Unless it's drawing too much.
Yeah.
If you have a 400 watt power supply and your computer is only estimated to pull 200 watts, that means you have 200 extra watts that, unless something goes horribly wrong, you should be safe.
Yeah. And most of my computers I overshoot by 2 to 250 because I estimate that I'm going to put in newer hardware, because I'm a gamer, to be able to overclock later, which is going to draw more power, so that gives you replaceability.
I'm a digital historian, so I'm going to be putting in a lot more hard drives, and those take up power as well.
I'll actually have a link for a power supply connector that I'll put up, or power supply calculator.
You know, we got show notes. Put a bunch of stuff in the show notes. Uber's already got stuff on the forums all about this topic, so if you have any questions or comments as this series goes by, you can contact Uber on the forums or via IRC, as always. Alright, so what's the first thing we need to showcase? What's the first thing you wanted to show for overclocking in this intro? Do you want to do the BIOS? Do you want to do hardware? You want to go through a hardware overview?
I want to go through OS preference, like we were starting to.
Alright.
OS preference, I prefer Windows. It's going to allow you to have access to more tools that will allow you to benchmark your computer. And that's important because if you have the benchmarks, you can see if your components in the first place are actually broken. You can actually get CPUs that are brand new that will run perfectly fine at your normal settings, but as soon as you go and you stress test it, so you run it as fast as it can, it shits the bed. You want to find that out as soon as possible. And you want to know that before you try to overclock it, because you're running up the voltage and you could possibly blow the CPU through the motherboard. We don't want to do that.
You also have to be careful because certain vendors, as soon as you open up the CPU packaging, they will not accept a refund or even an exchange. So before you even buy your CPU and your motherboard combo, make sure that where you're getting it from, the actual vendor, will allow you to say, okay, well, my CPU is not operating under my functional characteristics. It might work out of the box, but it's not working the way I want it to, and they will allow you to exchange it. Some places will actually charge you up to a 15% restocking fee, so if you have to keep, you know, asking for a new CPU every 3 weeks and you still have to pay 15%, so if you spend $100 on that and you got to spend money to send it back, plus money